Sometimes the loneliest person in the room is the one everyone believes has everything. The bells of St. Andrew's Cathedral echoed across downtown Chicago on a bright autumn morning as hundreds of distinguished guests filled the historic sanctuary with quiet anticipation. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of white roses. A string quartet played softly beneath stained glass windows, and television cameras waited outside to capture what every major news network had already called the wedding of the year. Victoria Morgan stood alone in the bridal suite, wearing an elegant ivory gown that reflected the morning sunlight with breathtaking grace. At only 37 years old, she had built Morgan Industries into one of the most successful companies in America. She had earned admiration from business leaders, respect from competitors, and recognition from millions of people who believed she represented the very definition of success. Yet none of those accomplishments had prepared her for the silence waiting just beyond the dressing room door. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Her fiancé stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but the uncertainty in his eyes revealed everything before he spoke a single word. He lowered his gaze and quietly folded his hands together. "Victoria, I cannot do this." She looked at him calmly, her expression unchanged. "Tell me why." He struggled to find the right words. "You deserve someone stronger than me. Everywhere we go, people know your name before they know mine. Every achievement belongs to you. I kept telling myself that would not matter, but I was wrong." Victoria listened without anger, without accusation. She had heard different versions of the same confession before. "You are afraid of living in my shadow," she said gently. He nodded. "I am." A long silence settled between them before Victoria offered a small, understanding smile. "Then thank you for being honest before we promised each other forever." He whispered an apology and quietly walked away, leaving behind a cathedral filled with guests who still believed the ceremony would begin in only a few minutes. Outside, reporters adjusted their cameras while social media counted down to the arrival of America's most admired billionaire chief executive officer. Inside, wedding planners exchanged nervous glances as whispered conversations spread from one pew to another. Victoria slowly removed her veil, folded it carefully across the chair, and walked toward the reception coordinator. The woman looked heartbroken. "What would you like us to do?" Victoria glanced through the window toward hundreds of untouched tables decorated with flowers, candles, and enough food to serve every invited guest. "Call every family shelter, community kitchen, and veteran center within 50 miles, she answered softly. "Make sure every meal is delivered before tonight. No celebration should end with good food being thrown away." The coordinator blinked in surprise. "Are you certain?" Victoria smiled with quiet grace. "Someone should still have a beautiful day today." Within an hour, volunteers began loading carefully prepared meals into delivery trucks, while florists donated thousands of fresh flowers to hospitals and nursing homes throughout the city. Church staff watched in respectful silence as Victoria thanked every musician, every server, every florist, and every volunteer individually before leaving through a quiet side entrance to avoid the growing crowd of reporters. She entered her waiting sport utility vehicle without answering a single question shouted through flashing cameras. As the city's skyline slowly disappeared behind her, Victoria drove toward the open highways of Illinois with no destination planned, hoping only to escape the noise that had followed her for so many years. Nearly 200 miles away, in the peaceful little town of Maple Ridge, a widowed single father named Ethan Brooks was quietly restoring a weathered rocking chair that had belonged to a stranger's grandmother, completely unaware that fate had already begun guiding the loneliest woman in America toward the simple life she never knew her heart had been searching for. Ethan Brooks believed that the finest things in life rarely made headlines. They arrived quietly with the sunrise, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of his daughter laughing from the kitchen, and the satisfaction of finishing honest work before the day came to an end. Maple Ridge was the kind of small Illinois town where people still greeted one another by name, where children rode bicycles down tree-lined streets until the porch lights came on, and where neighbors measured success by character rather than possessions. Ethan fit into that rhythm as naturally as autumn leaves belonged on old maple trees. Every weekday began before dawn. He packed 8-year-old Emma's lunch, carefully braided her blonde hair after years of determined practice, and drove her to Maple Ridge Elementary in his aging blue pickup truck that had traveled well over 200,000 miles but still started faithfully every morning. Emma smiled as she climbed out carrying a backpack almost as large as herself. "Do not forget to pick me up after our class," she reminded him. Ethan laughed softly. "I have never forgotten once." She grinned. "I know. I just like hearing you promise." After watching her disappear through the school doors, Ethan drove a few blocks to Brooks Restoration, a modest woodworking shop filled with forgotten treasures waiting for another chance. Antique rocking chairs, handcrafted cabinets, grandfather clocks, and weathered dining tables lined the walls beneath warm morning sunlight that streamed through tall windows, filling the workshop with floating specks of sawdust that shimmered like tiny stars. The comforting scent of cedar, polished oak, and fresh coffee welcomed every visitor. Ethan often said that restoring old furniture was not simply about repairing wood. It was about honoring memories that deserved to keep living. Late that morning, Mrs. Evelyn Harper carefully carried an old cedar chest into the workshop with the help of her grandson. Time had faded its finish, loosened its hinges, and covered its surface with countless scratches gathered over decades. Ethan gently ran his hand across the worn wood before smiling. "This chest has lived a good life." Mrs. Harper nodded with moist eyes. "My father built it before he left for military service. It has been part of our family ever since." Ethan looked up warmly. "Then, we will make sure it stays part of your family for many more years." She quietly asked, "How much will it cost?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Bring Emma one of your apple pies when it is finished, and we will call it even." Mrs. Harper smiled through grateful tears. "You always find a way to make kindness feel easy." Ethan simply shrugged. "Some things are worth more than money." That afternoon, Emma burst into the workshop after school, carrying a colorful drawing. "Daddy, look." The picture showed their white farmhouse beneath bright orange maple trees, with two figures holding hands beneath a sky filled with birds. Across the top, she had carefully written, "Home is where hearts feel safe." Ethan studied the drawing with quiet admiration. "That might be the most beautiful house I have ever seen." Emma giggled. "It is our house." Together, they loaded the repaired rocking chair for another customer into the pickup truck before driving slowly through Maple Ridge, waving to neighbors gathered outside the bakery, hardware store, and post office. It was an ordinary day filled with ordinary moments, yet Ethan never once wished for a different life. While countless people across America admired success measured by wealth and recognition, he quietly believed that a peaceful evening shared with the person you loved most was a fortune no bank could ever protect. At that exact moment, many miles away, Victoria Morgan continued driving farther from Chicago with no destination in mind, unaware that every mile was carrying her closer to the quiet little town where an ordinary father had already built the extraordinary life her heart had been longing to find. By late Friday afternoon, the towering buildings of Chicago had disappeared completely behind rolling fields painted in shades of gold, crimson, and amber. Victoria Morgan had driven for hours without checking the time, answering a telephone call, or opening the carefully organized schedule resting on the passenger seat beside her. For the first time in years, no one knew exactly where she was, and she found the unfamiliar feeling strangely comforting. She rolled down the window and allowed the cool autumn breeze to carry away the noise that had followed her for so long. A weathered wooden sign appeared beside the highway. "Welcome to Maple Ridge." The quiet little town seemed almost untouched by the endless rush she had left behind. Children laughed outside an old-fashioned ice cream shop, while neighbors waved from front porches without looking at expensive watches or hurriedly checking mobile phones. Victoria parked beside a family-owned bakery and stepped inside, where the warm aroma of cinnamon, fresh bread, apple pie, and brewed coffee immediately replaced the polished scent of corporate boardrooms. The elderly woman behind the counter greeted her with a genuine smile. You look like someone who could use something sweet. Victoria smiled politely. Is it that obvious? The woman laughed softly. Only because everyone who walks through that door carrying the weight of the world usually orders the cinnamon rolls. Victoria ordered one together with a cup of coffee before sitting quietly beside the front window, watching ordinary life unfold outside. A handwritten poster near the entrance announced the Maple Ridge Harvest Festival beginning the following morning. Families, music, homemade crafts, pie contests, and community games filled the colorful flyer with a kind of joy that could never be purchased. Victoria folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her purse. Maybe I will stay one more day, she whispered to herself. As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, she decided to explore the peaceful countryside surrounding the town before checking into the small bed and breakfast recommended by the bakery owner. The narrow country road wound gently through fields bordered by towering maple trees glowing beneath the setting sun. Everything felt wonderfully still until a warning light suddenly illuminated the dashboard of her silver sport utility vehicle. Moments later, the engine lost power. Victoria calmly guided the vehicle onto the shoulder beneath a canopy of brilliant autumn leaves before stepping outside and lifting the hood. She stared at the engine with an amused smile. I can negotiate billion-dollar agreements, she quietly admitted to herself. But I have absolutely no idea what I am looking at. The countryside answered only with rustling leaves and distant birdsong. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the sound of another engine approached from around the gentle bend in the road. An aging blue pickup truck slowed naturally before pulling onto the shoulder several yards behind her. A tall man climbed out carrying a worn metal toolbox while a young blonde girl leaned curiously against the passenger window, watching with bright blue eyes. The man walked toward Victoria with an easy smile that carried neither hesitation nor recognition. Looks like your afternoon could use an extra pair of hands, he said warmly. Victoria returned the smile, relieved more by his kindness than by the offer itself. I was beginning to think I might be spending the night with my engine. He laughed quietly before setting the toolbox on the pavement. Let's see if your vehicle simply needs someone willing to listen to it for a few minutes. Neither of them realized that beneath the quiet maple trees of an ordinary Illinois country road, two completely different worlds had just met without titles, expectations, or introductions, and the smallest act of kindness was about to begin changing both of their lives forever. Ethan set his weathered toolbox on the pavement before offering Victoria the same warm smile he would have given any stranger passing through Maple Ridge. Let us see what your vehicle is trying to tell us, he said. Victoria stepped aside while he leaned over the engine compartment with calm concentration, studying every cable and connection without rushing. The only sounds were rustling maple leaves, distant birds, and the occasional passing breeze that carried the scent of harvested fields across the quiet countryside. After several careful minutes, Ethan tightened a loose battery terminal, adjusted a worn cable, and gently closed the hood. Try it now, he said. Victoria climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine immediately settled into a smooth, steady rhythm. She stepped back outside with a look of genuine relief that had nothing to do with business success or public recognition. You have no idea how grateful I am, she said sincerely. She reached into her purse and removed several $100 bills before offering them to him. Ethan looked at the money for only a brief moment before smiling politely and shaking his head. Thank you, but I cannot accept that. Victoria frowned with surprise. You just saved my entire weekend. Ethan shrugged gently. It only took a few minutes. Besides, kindness is worth much less if it always comes with an invoice. Before Victoria could answer, the passenger door of the pickup truck opened and a little blonde girl skipped happily toward them, carrying a small paper bag. Daddy, I saved the last cinnamon roll, she announced proudly before noticing Victoria. She stopped politely and smiled. Hello, I am Emma. Victoria knelt so they could speak at the same height. Hello, Emma. I am Victoria. Emma looked thoughtfully into Victoria's eyes for several seconds with the fearless honesty only children seem to possess. Ethan laughed softly. She is thinking. Emma nodded seriously before asking, May I ask you something? Victoria smiled. Of course. The little girl tilted her head. Why do you look like you are pretending to smile? Ethan immediately looked embarrassed. Emma, sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups ask questions inside their heads instead of out loud. Victoria gently raised one hand. It is all right. She looked toward the endless rows of maple trees glowing beneath the late afternoon sun before quietly answering. Because sometimes people forget what it feels like to be happy, even when everyone believes they should be. Emma thought carefully about those words before opening the paper bag and holding out the cinnamon roll with both hands. Daddy says sharing makes almost every day better. Victoria accepted the warm pastry with unexpected emotion. Thank you. Ethan smiled quietly. She believes food fixes more problems than mechanics do. Emma giggled. Sometimes it does. The three of them stood together beneath the golden leaves while the last light of the afternoon settled gently across the peaceful country road. Victoria suddenly realized that neither Ethan nor Emma had asked what she did for a living, where she came from, or why she was traveling alone. They had treated her as though she were simply another person in need of help. It was a feeling she could barely remember experiencing. Ethan glanced toward the colorful Harvest Festival flyer resting on the passenger seat inside her vehicle. If you're staying in town tonight, he said, the festival begins tomorrow morning. Maple Ridge is at its best this weekend. Emma smiled hopefully. Will you come? There will be music, homemade pie, and the best pumpkin pancakes in Illinois. Victoria looked from the little girl to the quiet man standing beside her and felt something inside her heart become lighter than it had been in years. I think, she answered with a genuine smile that no longer needed pretending. I would like that very much. Saturday morning arrived, wrapped in brilliant autumn sunshine, as Maple Ridge transformed into a celebration of everything that made small-town America feel timeless. Strings of warm lights stretched across Main Street, while local musicians tuned their guitars beneath a wooden gazebo decorated with pumpkins, colorful quilts, and baskets overflowing with fresh apples. The rich aroma of cinnamon, maple syrup, roasted corn, and homemade pies drifted through the cool air as children laughed beside hayrides and neighbors greeted one another with familiar smiles that had been exchanged for generations. Victoria arrived wearing a simple cream sweater, blue jeans, comfortable boots, and a light scarf that allowed her to blend naturally into the cheerful crowd. For the first time in years, no one looked at her with admiration for her accomplishments or curiosity about her fortune. To everyone around her, she was simply another visitor enjoying a beautiful autumn weekend. Ethan waved when he spotted her near the town square. Good morning, he said warmly. Victoria smiled with surprising ease. I think this may be the first Saturday in years that nobody has asked me to sign a document. Ethan laughed softly. Around here, the only thing anyone signs is the guest book for the pie contest. Emma hurried over carrying 2 steaming cups of hot apple cider. One for you, she said proudly as she handed a cup to Victoria. Daddy says cold mornings are better with warm drinks. Victoria accepted it with genuine gratitude. Thank you, Emma. The little girl slipped her hand into Victoria's without hesitation and began leading her through the festival. They watched children painting birdhouses, families carving pumpkins, and elderly neighbors teaching young volunteers how to weave handmade baskets. Everywhere Victoria looked, people seemed genuinely happy without trying to impress anyone. Later that morning, they stopped beside Ethan's woodworking booth, where he quietly demonstrated how to restore an antique rocking chair. A line of curious visitors gathered around him while he patiently explained that every scratch told part of the chair's story and deserved respect rather than being hidden. An elderly gentleman approached, carrying an old wooden toolbox with a broken handle. Would you be willing to repair this? He asked. Ethan carefully examined it before smiling. It belonged to someone important. The man nodded. My father. Ethan closed the toolbox gently and handed it back. Bring it to my workshop on Monday. We will make sure it is ready for another generation. How much do I owe you? The man asked. Ethan smiled exactly as he had beside Victoria's vehicle the day before. Just promise you will tell your grandchildren who first carried it. Victoria quietly watched the exchange. She had spent years negotiating contracts worth millions of dollars, yet she had never seen anyone become so wealthy by refusing payment. As the afternoon sun warmed the festival grounds, Emma looked up at Victoria with thoughtful eyes. "Can I ask another question?" "Victoria smiled. "I think you probably will anyway." Emma giggled. "If you go back home tomorrow, will you forget us?" The innocent question settled gently into the quiet afternoon. Victoria looked across the festival toward Ethan, who was helping a young boy sand a small wooden toy airplane with patient encouragement. He never looked toward her, never tried to influence her answer, and never expected anything in return. She slowly squeezed Emma's little hand. "I do not think forgetting either of you will ever be possible." Emma beamed with happiness and wrapped her arms around Victoria in a spontaneous hug that caught her completely by surprise. Victoria embraced the little girl with quiet emotion, unaware that at that very moment a black luxury sport utility vehicle carrying 2 corporate security officers and her executive assistant had just crossed the Maple Ridge town limits after finally discovering where the missing chief executive officer had disappeared. The joyful music of the Harvest Festival continued drifting through Maple Ridge until the arrival of a sleek black sport utility vehicle quietly changed the rhythm of the afternoon. The vehicle stopped beside the town square, and 2 professionally dressed corporate security officers stepped out before opening the rear door for Victoria's executive assistant. Their polished appearance contrasted sharply with the handmade quilts, wooden crafts, and smiling families surrounding them. Victoria noticed them immediately. The peaceful smile that had rested naturally on her face slowly faded as the familiar weight of responsibility returned to her shoulders. Her assistant approached respectfully, never raising her voice. "Miss Morgan," she said gently, "we have been looking for you everywhere." Victoria nodded calmly. "I imagined you eventually would." The assistant held out a tablet, displaying dozens of national headlines. Billionaire chief executive officer vanishes after wedding cancellation. Morgan Industries shares await public statement. Mystery woman spotted in small Illinois town. Victoria quietly turned off the screen before anyone nearby could read another headline. "Thank you," she said softly. One of the security officers stepped closer with professional courtesy. "The board meeting begins Monday morning. Investors are requesting your presence, and several news organizations have already traced your location to Maple Ridge. Reporters are expected to arrive before sunset." Ethan listened quietly from a respectful distance without interrupting. He looked around the festival where children continued laughing, neighbors shared homemade pie, and elderly couples danced beneath strings of warm lights. "That would change this town," he said thoughtfully. Victoria lowered her eyes. "Yes, it would." Emma gently tugged on Victoria's sleeve. "Are those people taking you home?" Victoria knelt beside her with a tender smile. "I think they have come to remind me where my responsibilities are." Emma looked disappointed, but remained thoughtful. Can people have 2 places they belong? The question lingered between them. Victoria gently brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from Emma's face. "Sometimes our hearts belong somewhere before our lives are able to follow." Ethan finally stepped closer, his expression calm and understanding. "Thousands of people depend on the decisions you make every day," he said quietly. Victoria looked into his eyes, silently hoping he might ask her to stay. He never did. "They deserve a leader who keeps her promises," he continued with quiet dignity. "You should go." His words carried no disappointment, only genuine respect for the responsibilities she carried. Victoria felt tears gathering despite her effort to remain composed. "You always seem to know the right thing to say." Ethan smiled gently. "No, I simply try to say the kind thing." Mrs. Evelyn Harper approached, carrying a freshly baked apple pie wrapped carefully in a checkered towel. "Every traveler deserves something that reminds them there are people wishing them well," she said warmly. Victoria accepted the gift with grateful hands. One by one, neighbors she had met only the day before quietly wished her a safe journey. No one asked for photographs. No one requested business advice. They simply treated her as Charlotte had always dreamed someone might treat her, as a person instead of title. As the late afternoon sun settled behind the maple trees, Victoria walked slowly toward her silver sport utility vehicle. Before opening the driver's door, she turned back one final time. Ethan stood beside Emma beneath the same golden leaves where they had first met, raising one hand in a simple farewell. Emma waved enthusiastically with both arms while smiling through hopeful eyes. Victoria smiled back, realizing she was not leaving behind a pleasant weekend. She was leaving behind the first place where success had never mattered and where, for the first time in many years, she had simply been allowed to be herself. Chicago welcomed Victoria back with polished skyscrapers, endless streams of traffic, and a calendar that seemed determined to fill every quiet moment she had discovered in Maple Ridge. Before sunrise on Monday morning, she was once again seated at the head of the long walnut conference table inside Morgan Industries, surrounded by executives presenting expansion plans, quarterly forecasts, and international investment opportunities. Every presentation was flawless. Every graph pointed upward. Every person in the room congratulated her for another record-breaking quarter. Victoria listened politely, signed the necessary documents, and thanked each department leader for their hard work. Yet while everyone around the table celebrated success, her thoughts drifted toward the smell of cedar inside Ethan's workshop, the laughter echoing through the Harvest Festival, and a little girl who believed cinnamon rolls could solve almost anything. It surprised her how quickly ordinary memories had become more valuable than extraordinary accomplishments. Meanwhile, life in Maple Ridge quietly returned to its familiar rhythm. Ethan unlocked Brooks Restoration before the first rays of sunlight reached the workshop windows, swept away yesterday's sawdust, brewed fresh coffee, and continued restoring the cedar chest that Mrs. Harper's father had built decades earlier. His hands remained steady, but his thoughts occasionally wandered toward the quiet woman who had unexpectedly appeared beneath the maple trees and just as unexpectedly disappeared again. He never spoke about her, believing some beautiful moments were meant simply to be appreciated rather than possessed. Emma, however, noticed everything. One evening while the two of them prepared dinner together, she carefully arranged vegetables on a cutting board before looking up with thoughtful eyes. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart," Ethan answered. "You miss Victoria?" Ethan smiled gently while continuing to slice carrots. "She has a very important life in Chicago." Emma folded her arms with playful determination. "That is not what I asked." Ethan paused before quietly admitting, "Yes, I do miss her." Emma grinned as though she had solved the easiest puzzle in the world. "I knew it." Hundreds of miles away, Victoria attended a formal charity gala surrounded by influential business leaders, elected officials, philanthropists, and investors. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft, golden light across elegant marble floors, while a string orchestra performed quietly in the background. Guests congratulated her resilience after the canceled wedding, praised her leadership, and eagerly discussed future partnerships. Victoria thanked each person with sincere courtesy, but every conversation somehow felt incomplete. During dinner, she reached into her handbag, searching for her reading glasses, and instead discovered the tiny wooden maple leaf Emma had quietly slipped in her pocket before saying goodbye. She gently traced its smooth, carved edges beneath the table, while the voices surrounding her gradually faded into the distance. No expensive gift she had ever received carried more meaning than that simple piece of wood. Later that evening, she returned alone to her penthouse apartment, overlooking the glowing Chicago skyline. She placed Mrs. Harper's handwritten apple pie recipe beside the little wooden maple leaf on her kitchen counter and stood quietly for several minutes. Her executive assistant called shortly afterward. "Tomorrow morning's interviews have been confirmed," she explained. "Several reporters are still asking about the unidentified man from Maple Ridge. Would you like us to issue a statement denying the speculation?" Victoria looked toward the little carved maple leaf resting beneath the warm kitchen light. A gentle smile slowly appeared. "No," she answered softly. "There is nothing to deny." At almost the exact same moment, Ethan stepped onto the front porch of his farmhouse after tucking Emma into bed. Beneath the same clear autumn sky stretching above both Maple Ridge and Chicago, he quietly looked toward the stars and whispered, "I hope you found the place where your heart can finally rest." Unknown to both of them, destiny had not yet finished writing their story, and before many more days had passed, the distance between two very different worlds would begin quietly disappearing once again. 1 week later, the annual Morgan Industries Leadership Summit filled the company's largest auditorium with executives, investors, employees, journalists, and television crews from across the country. Victoria stood backstage wearing an elegant navy business suit, reviewing the speech her communications team had carefully prepared. Every page celebrated profits, innovation, and expansion into new markets. Yet every sentence felt strangely distant from the person she had become after one quiet weekend in Maple Ridge. She slowly closed the folder, set it aside, and walked toward the stage carrying only her own thoughts. Warm applause filled the auditorium as she stepped behind the podium overlooking hundreds of familiar faces. "Good morning," she began with a calm smile. "For many years, I believed leadership was measured by growth charts, quarterly reports, and financial success. Recently, I discovered that the greatest lessons sometimes come from people who have never appeared on a magazine cover." Curious whispers spread gently across the audience. Victoria continued speaking about kindness, community, and the extraordinary strength hidden inside ordinary lives. Several members of the board exchanged puzzled looks. This was not the presentation they had expected. At that very moment, the rear doors of the auditorium quietly opened. Ethan Brooks entered wearing the only dark suit he owned, neatly pressed but simple beside the expensive designer clothing surrounding him. Beside him walked Emma, wearing a light blue dress and carrying a beautifully handcrafted wooden box with both hands. Earlier that morning, Ethan had received a handwritten envelope delivered to Brooks Restoration by overnight courier. Inside were 3 official guest passes and a brief note from Victoria's executive assistant that read, "She asked me to prepare these several days ago. I believe part of her hoped you might come, even if she never found the courage to ask." Security welcomed Ethan and Emma with quiet respect before guiding them toward the center aisle. Victoria looked up from the stage, her heart stopping for a single unforgettable moment as she recognized them. Ethan slowly walked forward while the auditorium became almost completely silent. Emma smiled encouragingly before placing the wooden box into her father's hands. Ethan stopped a few feet from the stage and looked directly at Victoria with the same gentle sincerity she had first seen beneath the maple trees. "I spend my days restoring things that people believe are beyond saving," he said softly. "Old rocking chairs, family heirlooms, wooden memories that simply need someone willing to care enough to repair them." He carefully opened the wooden box. Inside rested a handcrafted silver engagement ring that he had patiently created himself during quiet evenings in his workshop. It was simple, elegant, and beautifully imperfect, just like the life he hoped to share. Ethan smiled warmly. "I cannot promise you a life without responsibilities. I cannot promise there will never be difficult days. I cannot promise headlines will disappear." He paused for a moment before continuing. "But I can promise there will always be someone waiting to ask how your heart is before asking how your business is doing. I can promise a home where your first name matters more than your last. Most of all, I can promise that Emma and I will always love you for the woman who stopped beside a country road, not for the title printed on an office door." Tears quietly filled Victoria's eyes. Ethan took one final step closer. "Victoria Morgan, before I ask you to become my wife, I want to ask something even more important. Will you let Emma call you family for the rest of her life?" The auditorium became so completely silent that even the soft hum of the ceiling lights seemed louder than before. Hundreds of people watched without moving, not because they were witnessing the proposal of a billionaire, but because they were watching 2 lonely hearts discover that true wealth had never been measured by what either of them owned. Victoria looked into Ethan's steady eyes as the handcrafted silver ring rested quietly between them. Beneath the warm lights of the auditorium, tears shimmered gently along her cheeks. But for the first time in many years, they carried no sadness. They carried peace. A tender smile slowly appeared as she stepped down from the stage and stopped only inches away from him. She reached for his hands without hesitation. "Yes," she whispered softly. "Yes, I will become your family." The simple words echoed through the silent auditorium more powerfully than the applause that followed. Ethan carefully slipped the handcrafted silver ring onto her finger with the same patient hands that had spent years restoring forgotten treasures. This time he was not repairing weathered wood. He was helping restore a heart that had almost forgotten how to trust again. Emma could no longer contain her excitement. She hurried forward and wrapped both of them in the happiest embrace her small arms could manage. Victoria knelt beside her, gently brushing away a tear from the little girl's smiling face. Emma looked at her with hopeful eyes. "May I call you Mom now?" Victoria smiled through quiet tears before embracing her tightly. "If that is what your heart wants, then I would be honored." The audience slowly rose to its feet. Executives, employees, investors, journalists, and even members of the board applauded with genuine emotion. They were no longer witnessing a remarkable business leader standing beside an ordinary craftsman. They were witnessing two people who had discovered that love built upon kindness could never be measured by titles, wealth, or public admiration. 1 year later, Morgan Industries continued growing under Victoria's thoughtful leadership, yet she never again allowed business success to become more important than the people waiting for her at home. Every Friday evening, she drove from Chicago to Maple Ridge without fail, where the warm lights of Ethan's farmhouse welcomed her before the sun disappeared beyond the maple trees. Ethan continued operating Brooks Restoration exactly as he always had. He politely declined offers to become an executive, spokesperson, or consultant because he believed his greatest purpose remained inside the small workshop where generations of family memories found new life through careful hands and quiet patience. Together, they established the Morgan Brooks Foundation, supporting single parents, preserving local trades, restoring community workshops, and providing scholarships for children growing up in small American towns. They insisted every project focus on dignity instead of publicity because kindness never needed applause to change someone's future. On a peaceful autumn evening exactly 1 year after their first meeting beside the quiet country road, the three of them returned beneath the same towering maple trees where Victoria's vehicle had first broken down. Golden leaves drifted gently through the cool evening air, while Emma laughed as she gathered the brightest ones into a small woven basket. Ethan smiled as he looked toward the familiar stretch of road. "It is amazing how one loose battery cable changed everything," he said softly. Victoria slipped her hand into his and watched Emma twirl happily beneath the falling leaves. "It was never the vehicle," she answered with quiet gratitude. "It was the first moment in my life when someone saw Victoria before they ever saw Morgan." The setting sun wrapped the peaceful countryside in warm golden light as the three of them slowly walked home together, proving that the greatest fortunes are never found inside bank accounts or boardrooms, but inside the simple blessing of returning each evening to people who love you for exactly who you are, where quiet dignity becomes the richest inheritance any family can ever leave behind.